All right, chapter 24, Ideologies of Change in Europe from 1815 to 1914. So this chapter, it starts out talking about a conservative peace gives way to radical ideas. Then it goes on to reforms and revolutions between 1815 and 1850. Then nation building in Italy, Germany, and Russia. Urban life in the age of ideologies. And nationalism and socialism from 1871 to 1914. So it starts out talking about political strife and social situation after 1815. And if you don't remember what happened around this time, this is when, the European powers defeated Napoleon, and they're going to unite under a revived conservatism to really try to stamp out the spread of these liberal and democratic reforms. So that's where we're starting. So after France was defeated, the Allies agreed to meet at the Congress of Vienna to organize a settlement that would stop the seeds of future wars. The main focus of the Congress of Vienna was to restrict French aggression, and Prussia received territory along its border with France. Moderation was shown to the French. They maintained an equilibrium of power and military forces that would discourage future aggressive states or the dominion of Europe by one state. The Quadruple Alliance, it consisted of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Great Britain. They decided to meet periodically to discuss issues to ensure that peace. So conservatism, or Metternich, that was Austria's foreign minister, and he developed policies that dominated the entire German Confederation. He wanted to purge any subversive ideas in the universities and newspapers. Liberal and radical organizations were to be punished. And Metternich defended class privileges and believed liberalism was responsible for the past generation of war in the United States and France. Just FYI, Metternich came from nobility. He was a prince. And so that idea of class privileges, that's kind of what he grew up believing in. So that kind of gives you an idea of his mindset. And liberalism was blamed for the vast amount of bloodshed and suffering. And Metternich believed that the lower classes only wanted peace and quiet. If liberals wanted each national group to have its own government, the stability of the Habsburg Empire, Austrian Empire, would be threatened. And there were over a dozen different ethnic groups living within that empire. So critics of liberalism also attack the economic freedoms granted to private business. Laissez-faire was a doctrine that allowed unrestricted enterprise with no government interference in the economy, hands-off approach when it came to the economy from the government. Adam Smith's opposition to mercantilism inspired his thoughts on free competitive of private business, on free competition of private businesses. This was the form of economic philosophy embraced in Great Britain. And liberals began pushing deeper into political issues, and intellectuals felt liberal movements did not go far enough and called for universal voting rights. Nationalism was another liberal thought that struck fear in the hearts of European monarchs. It held that members of each ethnic group had the right to encourage cultural unity. Nationalists intended to make each cultural territory coincide with borders that constructed an independent nation-state. For the Habsburgs of Austria, the Ottomans, and the Romanovs of Russia, this thought was explosive. For many African and Asian colonies, European influences had become a major part of their ethnic identity. Religion and other various components of culture had been established as part of the local culture. Nationalistic thought developed into a pattern of ethnic identity of we and they, where the we saw the they as enemies. So we the people, sometimes they the government. That also plays into this a little bit. Some saw individualism as a shattering of society, and a move to influence international unity and community was based on economic planning and state regulations. French thinkers dreamed of social utopias and self-sufficient communities. Some called for total emancipation for women and the abolition of marriage. Relationships, according to thinkers such as Fourier, should be based on free unions of love and sexual freedom. Karl Marx established the foundation of socialism in his work, The Communist Manifesto, and he laid out the conflicts between the employees, who he identified as the proletariat, against the middle class he identified as the bourgeoisie. Benefits from industrialization spread slowly and unevenly, and the rapid growth of industrial urban centers led to overcrowding, poor sanitation, and the spread of disease. Despite urbanization, the large majority of people remained in agricultural work, but under changing conditions of enclosure and rapid population growth. Social and economic dissatisfaction were often exacerbated by new post-Congress of Vienna border arrangements, leaving many dissatisfied with government, with whom they were also unfamiliar. And then also widespread crop failures in the 1845 through 1846 year contributed to political disruptions in the late 1840s. Protests convinced the British monarchy to reform social aspects of their rule and control, and so we have the Reform Bill of 1832, and that allowed the House of Commons to become the all-important legislative body. It also gave the industrial areas of the country representatives in the Commons. The number of British voters increased by 50%. These reforms alleviated some of the social tension throughout Great Britain. The 10 Hours Act was passed, limiting the workday for women and young people working in factories. The Irish did not benefit from the reforms. Ireland was still considered to be a conquered land with a majority of Catholic peasants, and the Catholic peasants rented land from members of the Protestant minority. Exploitation of the Irish Catholic peasants fueled deep resentments. So going on over in France, though, France's situation was different than Great Britain's. While more people did get the right to vote, it was only a small increase. People felt left out of the political process. The disappointment led to revolt in Paris. Revolutionary compassion and sympathy led to freedom of all slaves throughout French colonies, the end of the death penalty, and national workshops for the unemployed. The argument between capitalism and socialism became a clash of classes and the use of arms. We have violent protests broke out when the government dissolved the national workshops. More than 10,000 people were killed or wounded. The anarchy in France allowed the rise of Napoleon. This is Louis Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, to take power in a landslide election. Louis Napoleon first dismissed the National Assembly and then seized total power in a coup. He then requested the French to allow him to become a hereditary emperor. His rule ended in a war with Prussia. And then revolution spread even further. The Austrian Empire confronted a revolution in Hungary. The Hungarians demanded national autonomy and full civil liberties, but the movement fell apart when the Habsburgs abolished serfdom and the peasant lost interest. The minority groups living in Hungary found a nationalistic movement of the Hungarians objectionable because they did not want to be considered Hungarians as much as they did not want to be considered Austrians. So Ferdinand I abdicated and his nephew, Franz Joseph, came to power. Russia sent troops into Hungary to ensure stability in the region. Prussian liberals wanted to reshape Prussia into a liberal constitutional monarchy. And so the Prussian king, Frederick Wilhelm, is it the sixth? I think that's right, granted liberal changes to merge Prussia into a greater national German state. When Austria and Russia renounced the Germans' movement, he reestablished the German Confederation, and the liberal movements in Germany ended up failing. Italians were interested in all of the European national movements and began to move in that direction as well. We have a count, and he's going to lead the region of Sardinia and maintain limited national goals, and he wanted unity through northern and central Italy. Cavour plotted with Napoleon III and goaded the Austrians into attacking Sardinia. The Franco-Sardinian alliance then defeated Austria, but France decided to compromise with the Austrians. Cavour only won Lombardy, and in rage, he's going to end up resigning. Popular revolts in Italian nationalism that salvaged his plan, though, and when he returned to power, the central Italian states were now willing to join his unified northern regions. Later, Garibaldi considered the job only half finished, and with secret support, he's going to move to Sicily, and then he's going to move on toward Rome. The efforts ended with the unified kingdom of Italy. Just letting you kind of get this idea here. This is the areas that we're talking about. Prussia's Wilhelm I considered Italy's unification as a sign that political change or war with France or Austria was possible. He now depended on Count Bismarck to head a new ministry and defy parliament. Bismarck declared the Prussian government would rule without a parliament. he had the bureaucracy continue to collect taxes and reorganize the army. So then the voters, they had expressed their disagreement of maintaining such a strong military. So Bismarck instigated a war with Austria with the intent of expelling the Austrians and from Prussian politics. Prussia was successful. German unification quickly followed the victory against France. The Franco-Prussian War saw the Prussian military defeat the French. The event was enough for southern German territories to join the North in national unity. So this is the unification of Germany following what was, going on there in Austria and Prussia. Now we're going to switch over and we're going to talk about the modernization of Russia. And respect for Russia had increased after Napoleon was forced back from Moscow. European identities considered Russia a new equal in international diplomacy. Russian defeat in the Crimean War demonstrated how far behind Russia actually was compared with Western European states. Alexander II began making social reforms, first of which was freedom for serfs. He also made strides in modernization for economic reasons. Railroad construction increased the country's ability to export grain. And if you will recall, they started exporting to the United States and other areas like this really resistant Russian wheat. In 1881, an anarchist assassinated Alexander II, causing the reform era of Russia to come to a very quick end. As Russia moved eastward with their empire building, confrontations developed with Japan. A war developed between Russia and Japan. Japan was victorious, leaving Russia defeated and humiliated. Laborers began to protest in Russia following the defeat by the Japanese. Strikes, peasant uprisings, and troop mutinies raged across Russia. In October of 1895, Tsar Nicholas II issued the October Manifesto, granting full civil rights and promised popular elections to quell the anarchy. The Tsar retained authority, but the popularly elected Duma, Russia's parliament, they gained the real legislative power. Here's Crimea, the Crimean War. Here's the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. Here's Greece for you, in case you're kind of wondering where all this is. This is right between what we consider like far Eastern Europe going into Russia and parts of Asia. The Russian Revolution of 1905. This is where we do have the overthrow complete. We get rid of like the Russian monarchy. So, improving the urban environment. I know I didn't say very much about the Russian Revolution. We'll come back to that later on. Western European cities were built wall to wall, and a few places of wide open space could still be found. The sanitary conditions were abysmal, with open drains and sewers running down the middle of the street. Can you imagine the smell? Edwin Chadwick believed that disease and death caused poverty and called for a cleaning of the city's environment. Sanitary movements won support in cities located in the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany. Germ theory was a belief that disease could be caused by the spread of living organisms that could be controlled. This breakthrough came from Louis Pasteur, who determined that the growth of living organisms in a beverage could be suppressed by heating it, a process that we now call pasteurization. The combination of germ theory and the public health movement reduced disease and saved millions of lives. To improve living conditions and to provide jobs, France began to rebuild Paris with parks, new streets, and housing. And as populations increased, European cities began to develop mass transportation. The gap between the rich and the poor remained, and urban development made society more diverse and less unified. Successful business families, once liberal in economic thought, were growing less radical and more aristocratic. The growth of industry demanded more specialized experts, such as engineers, architects, chemists, and other professionals. So education became an expense as middle-class parents wanted their children educated, as so to increase their chances in those specialized fields of employment, and also, get better pay for it. So highly skilled workers became known as the labor aristocracy. This group also included highly skilled handcraft trades. Semi-skilled and unskilled workers became factory employees who earned good wages. Below them were a larger group of unskilled laborers who were day laborers. To help make ends meet, working class wives joined the workforce in various forms of service. Leisure time was also important for the middle class population that needed an occasional avenue of escape. And music was important. Sports usually revolved around animal contests like cockfighting or bull baiting. Middle-class women lacked legal rights and faced discrimination in education and in employment. And so well-paying jobs were most of the times off limits to women. Husbands and wives were expected to have emotional ties with each other and their children. More marriages were for love or sexual attraction now than they had been previously from money and family pressures. French sex manuals identified that women had legitimate sexual needs and had the, quote, right to orgasm, end quote. Women in industrialized countries began limiting the number of their children, which caused a reduction in the size of the average family. Scientists such as Louis Pasteur had influenced the understanding and the dangers of an unsanitary society. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution caught the interest of the general public, and his theory was entitled On the Origin of Species by the Means of Natural Selection. His theory on natural selection provoked resistance. Others took Darwin's theory and combined it with social issues, in which it's now called social Darwinism, focused on the theory of biological evolution in humans. Social Darwinism became part of the foundation for the attempts to find the missing link and establish the Aryan race, which was never Darwin's whole point. He was only talking about the origins of species and how over time certain species had evolved to look or had adapted to the environment in a certain way. What we have done, we have taken that and ran with it and made it into this giant monster of survival of the fittest, which was never his real intention if you go back and actually look at the work itself. Cultural shifts that are happening. Romanticism developed as a political and societal thoughts mixed with culture and artistic life. Romanticists believed that the supreme purpose in life was to develop the full unique human potential of a person's life. So we have a lot of influential composers. Romantic literary authors included Victor Hugo, who wrote stories intended to make the reader think. Among his work, you probably heard of this or maybe even seen the Disney adaptation of The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Other authors of the era, you probably heard of the Grimm brothers or Brothers Grimm. They wrote the scary stories that was also turned into a movie. So beginning in the 1840s, though, Romanticism gave way to realism, and realist writers put a critical focus on everyday life of the era exactly as it was. They moved into unexplored topics of sex, violence, and alcoholism. More and more women began to demand the right to vote, and the first success was in the western United States, and by 1913, women had suffrage, or the right to vote, in 12 states. Norway also had success where most women had the right to vote, and as the right to vote spread, politicians represented their people a little more responsibly. Bismarck tried to stop socialism in Germany, so we're going to switch over and talk about Germany for a minute, obviously the German Empire, but he tried to stop socialism in Germany because he feared its revolutionary atmosphere. He created social measures to win the support of the working class so that they would not move in the opposite direction. The new emperor, Wilhelm II, was eager to rule in his own right and forced Bismarck to resign. Under Wilhelm II, we see laws being passed to aid workers and legalize the socialist political activity. His foreign policy changed profoundly and also for the worse. German socialists were increasingly identified with the German state and concentrated on gradual social and political reform. Over in France, after the defeat of the Franco-Prussian War, French society was once again divided. Patriotic frustration led to the Paris Commune and the demand that it rule France. The National Assembly refused and turned the army against the Paris Commune and smashed it, killing 20,000 people. The moderate Republicans legalized the trade unions and provided compulsory elementary education for French boys and girls, reducing the influence of the Catholic Church and what it had on education in France. The tensions between church and state eased until the development of the Dreyfus Affair. Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish captain in the French army and falsely accused of treason. He was convicted in a case that again split France apart. On one side were the military and the Catholic establishment. On the other side were the civil libertarians and the radical Republicans. He will be acquitted, but the Dreyfus Affair helped to break the ties between the French state and the church. So in Ireland and Great Britain, they remained on the brink of a civil war. The Irish famine fueled revolutionary movements, and the British began making concessions but refused to grant Ireland autonomy. Irish Catholics continued to seek home rule, but the Protestants vowed to resist the movement toward that home rule. Austria continued to confront issues with the Hungarian population. The Austrians defeated the Hungarians and then occupied Hungary and ruled them. Emperor Francis Joseph made serious attempts to Germanize the language and culture, but after the defeat at the hands of Prussia, the situation established the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Let's talk about the Jewish emancipation really quickly, though. Jews gradually gained civil rights in more liberal Western European states. The new German Empire abolished restrictions on Jewish marriage and occupational choices. The economic situation for Western European Jews had improved. Most Jews identified with their national European state and considered themselves to be patriotic to their European governments. So when the economic environment took a downturn, though, many in Europe began to blame the Jews and their financial control. Anti-Semites created modern political parties based on anti-Jewish rhetoric that appealed to lower middle-class citizens. And we do have like this growing anti-Semitic response and with a movement to establish a Jewish state, and this movement was called Zionism. Economic hard times brought socialist leaders together to form the Second International of Socialists. The delegates would meet regularly to discuss Marxist doctrine. There was not enough political strength to support a radical movement, but the Socialist Party was increasing in numbers. As the size grew, workers became moderately militant and demanded gains. British unions avoided radical politics and concentrated on improved wages and working conditions. German unions did not have their rights until the late 1860s, and the German trade unions and their leaders became revisionist. Revisionism was an effort to update Marxist doctrine to reflect on the current times. So as we're going through, like these are all, seriously, these are social experiments. Like democracy that we practice here in the United States, this is a social experiment that we're trying, and we're still trying to figure it out 200 years later, right? Socialism, that's another social experiment to kind of move away from monarchy. You have nationalism. So don't think of these as necessarily a bad thing, although we don't practice all of that here in the United States. What works for the US might not work, as we know, for other cultures. So communism, although we here in the United States don't agree with it, it might make sense in a different culture that adheres to communism. And that's just what these different societies are trying during this time period. They're just trying to figure out what works with them. We've had civil war, we've had, kingdoms topple, we've had different kingdoms are merging with each other, and they're trying to navigate that. And they're trying to figure out, like, is this going to work or is it not? Like, obviously that's not going to work, so let's move on and try something different. And that's what we see. This is really an age of trial and error, which you could argue it's still going on today. We're still having upheaval. We're still having things happening and trying to figure things out as we move along in society. So it's kind of interesting. If you go back and actually read through the book, you'll get so much more detail, obviously, about these different movements and what's happening. And also, don't forget, you're going to write in a few weeks about political ideologies. And so this is going to help if you can go back and refresh your memory about what exactly is nationalism, socialism, Marxism, communism, democracy, republicanism.